There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a Georgia plantation after dusk. It's not a peaceful silence. It's a heavy, breathing quiet, thick with the humidity of secrets and the weight of unspeakable things. In 1838, on a sprawling estate known as Willow Creek, that silence was shattered by a scream. But the true horror was not the scream itself. It was the meticulous, cruel, and almost perfect lie that was constructed in its echo. This is not just a story of a murder. It is a story of a different kind of evil one that wore the polished boots and genteel smile of a respected Southern gentleman. It's a story about how a man could look at his own wife, the mother of his children, the keeper of his home, and see not a partner, but a problem that needed to be disposed of. And so, he devised a plan so cold, so calculating, that it would use the very injustices of his brutal world as its primary weapon. He would frame his wife for a murder that never should have happened, hiding his crime in plain sight, confident that the world would believe the hysterical woman over the pillar of the community. Our story begins not with the bloodshed, but with the illusion of a perfect life. Jonathan Ashworth was the picture of antebellum success. His wealth, built on the backs of the enslaved, was considerable. His land, fertile and vast, stretched towards the horizon. And his wife, Eleanor, was considered a jewel of Savannah society, graceful, educated, and possessing a gentle beauty that was often remarked upon in drawing-room whispers. But behind the grand columns of the plantation house, a sickness was growing. Jonathan Ashworth was a man drowning in debts accrued from a lifetime of excess and arrogance. And Eleanor had begun to see the monster behind the mask. She spoke of his temper, she worried over his dealings. She had, quite inconveniently, developed a conscience regarding the institution that funded her gowns and porcelain. Jonathan needed a solution, a permanent one. He needed Eleanor's fortune, which was tied up in a trust he could not access without her death or proven insanity. And he needed a scapegoat. His gaze fell upon the people he considered his property, and a plan, dark and serpentine, began to coil in his mind. He would orchestrate a death, not Eleanor's, that would be too simple, too suspicious. No, he would create a victim from his own household, and he would make sure every shred of evidence pointed directly to his gentle, kind-hearted wife. He was not just planning a murder, he was crafting a narrative, a Southern Gothic tragedy where the delicate lady of the house would be revealed as a venomous serpent. The stage was set, the players were in place, unaware of the roles they were being forced to play. All that was needed was the first act. And it would begin with a young enslaved woman named Sarah and a whispered secret she was never meant to hear. Sarah was not a name you would find in the plantation ledger. To Jonathan Ashworth, she was merely the housemaid, Eliza's girl. But to those who dared to see her as human, she was a young woman with observant eyes and a quiet intelligence that made her invaluable in the main house and a potential threat. She moved through the rooms like a shadow, polishing silver, dusting portraits of stern-faced ancestors, and overhearing conversations meant for privileged ears. On the evening the plan was set in motion, she had been clearing the dinner service, her movements silent and efficient, when the low, urgent tones from Jonathan's study snagged her attention. The door was slightly ajar. She saw the flicker of firelight on the faces of two men, Master Ashworth and the overseer, a brutish man named Riggs, whose very presence soured the air. "Must look like a crime of passion," Ashworth was saying, his voice a cold, steady murmur. "Her favorite shawl, the one from Charleston, it must be found there. Do you understand? There can be no room for doubt." Sarah didn't hear more. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She knew her could only be the mistress. Eleanor Ashworth had shown Sarah small, fleeting kindnesses, a leftover biscuit, a soft word when she was caught in a coughing fit. To hear her name in such a venomous context, paired with the overseer's cruel smirk, filled Sarah with a dread that was far colder than the fear of a whipping. This was something darker, She retreated into the shadows of the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. What had she heard? A crime of passion? A shawl? She was holding a secret that felt like a live coal in her hands, a secret she could not reveal without risking her own life, yet one she could not ignore. The next morning, the air at Willow Creek was different. It was taut, charged with an unspoken tension. Jonathan was unusually attentive to Eleanor, complimenting her, insisting she take her evening walk in the gardens to enjoy the jasmine, as was her custom. He suggested she wear the delicate embroidered shawl from Charleston, the one she treasured. "The night air carries a chill, my dear," he said, his voice dripping with a counterfeit concern that would later haunt every witness's memory. Eleanor, touched by his sudden affection, complied, wrapping the soft wool around her shoulders, unknowingly draping herself in the central piece of her husband's bloody evidence. Meanwhile, Riggs sought out a field hand named Isaiah. Isaiah was a man of immense strength and a simmering, quiet defiance that had often earned him the business end of Riggs's whip. Riggs, following his master's design, provoked a confrontation over a supposedly broken tool. The argument was loud, public, and designed to be remembered. It ended with Riggs snarling a threat that slithered through the slave quarters. "Disobey me again, and you'll see what happens to those who cross the master." The stage was now fully set. The players, the kind mistress, the rebellious slave, the cruel overseer, and the silent witness were all in their places. The curtain was about to rise on a horror that would forever stain the Georgia red clay. The jasmine that evening was particularly potent, its sweet, cloying scent clinging to the humid air like a funeral shroud. Eleanor walked the gravel paths, her fingers trailing over the blooms, the cherished shawl a soft weight upon her shoulders. She was lost in thought, perhaps in a rare moment of peace, or perhaps turning over the disquieting pieces of her life with Jonathan, the whispered arguments, the missing funds from her dowry, the coldness in his eyes that had replaced their early affection. She did not hear the careful footsteps that crunched on the gravel behind her, steps that did not belong to her. In the slave quarters, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. The public humiliation of Isaiah by Riggs had sent a clear, terrifying message. Fear was a currency. Jonathan Ashworth and his overseer spent freely. Sarah, trying to blend into the background, watched Isaiah from a distance. She saw the rage and humiliation burning in his eyes, a fire that Riggs had deliberately stoked. She wanted to warn him, to whisper what she had overheard, but the risk was too great. To be caught conspiring would mean a death sentence, or worse. So she remained silent, a prisoner of the terrible knowledge festering inside her. Back in the garden, the scene was unfolding with a chilling precision. From the shadow of a large live oak, a figure watched Eleanor. It was Riggs. He waited until she reached the most secluded part of the garden, a small, manicured circle surrounded by high hedges, far from the house's listening ears. He then gave a sharp, low whistle, a signal. On cue, from another shadow, a second figure emerged. This one was smaller, stumbling. It was Isaiah. His hands were bound loosely in front of him, and his face was a mask of confusion and terror. Riggs had dragged him here, a pawn in the master's game. What happened next was a brutal, swift pantomime of violence. Riggs, with a grunt of effort, shoved Isaiah forward, sending him sprawling to the ground at Eleanor's feet. Startled, Eleanor gasped and took a step back, her hand flying to her throat. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice trembling. But Riggs wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Isaiah, and in his eyes was a command as clear as it was deadly. In that frozen moment, Isaiah understood. He was not here to be punished. He was here to be a prop. He was here to die. Before Eleanor could scream, before Isaiah could plead, Riggs moved. He raised a heavy, leather-wrapped blackjack and brought it down once, twice, with sickening thuds on the back of Isaiah's head. The man crumpled, lifeless, onto the manicured grass. Eleanor's scream finally tore through the night, a raw, piercing sound of pure horror. It was the scream Jonathan had been waiting for. As the sound died, echoing into the heavy silence, the final piece of the deception was put into place. As Eleanor stood paralyzed, staring at the body at her feet, Riggs stepped forward, not towards her, but to the ground beside Isaiah's still form. With a deliberate, theatrical motion, he pulled a small, pearl-handled knife from his belt, a knife every servant in the house would later identify as belonging to Eleanor's private writing desk, and pressed it into the dead man's hand, closing his fingers around the handle. The scene was complete. For a heartbeat, the world stood still. Eleanor Ashworth stood frozen, her mind refusing to stitch together the horrific tableau, the body of Isaiah, the overseer's cold efficiency, her own pearl-handled knife now grotesquely clutched in the dead man's hand. The sweet scent of jasmine had become the smell of blood and raw earth. Then the world snapped back into violent motion. Riggs turned his gaze on her. There was no menace in it, not in the way she might have expected. It was something far worse, a look of feigned, grim duty. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice flat and loud, meant to carry. "I saw him lurch at you. I had to do it, to protect you." The lie was so audacious, so perfectly delivered, that it stole the breath from her lungs. She could only stare, her mouth agape, as he strode past her, his shoulder roughly brushing her shawl, pulling it from her shoulders. It fluttered to the ground, landing perilously close to Isaiah's outstretched hand, a splash of delicate embroidery on the dark, damp grass. "No!" The word was a whisper, a puff of air. It was all she could manage. She understood then, with a clarity that felt like a physical blow. This was not a tragedy, it was a trap, and she was standing at its very center. The commotion began. Riggs was already bellowing for help, his voice cutting through the plantation's silence like an axe. "To the garden! There's been an attack! The mistress!" Lanterns flared to life in the main house. Doors slammed. The thunder of boots on the veranda grew closer. Within moments, they were surrounded by a crowd of wide-eyed house servants and a few field hands roused from their sleep. They saw what they were meant to see, their master's wife, pale and trembling, standing over the body of a strong field hand, the overseer, standing protectively near her, his weapon still in hand. And the damning evidence, the knife from her desk, her favorite shawl on the ground. It was at that moment that Jonathan Ashworth made his entrance. He pushed through the crowd, his face a masterful bullion of confusion and dawning horror. "Eleanor! My God, what has happened?" He rushed to her side, but his eyes were not on her. They were scanning the scene, taking inventory of his planted evidence. He saw the shawl. He saw the knife. A barely perceptible nod to Riggs sealed the narrative. He then turned to his wife, taking her by the shoulders. Did he assault you, my dear?" he asked, his voice filled with a terrible, feigned concern. The question, posed in front of everyone, was the final nail in her coffin. It framed the entire event not as a mysterious killing, but as a defensive act against a violent slave, with Eleanor as the fragile, traumatized victim. But as his hands gripped her shoulders, his fingers dug in, a silent, brutal command to play her part. In that touch, Eleanor felt the full, monstrous weight of his deception. She was not a victim of the man on the ground. She was a victim of the man holding her. The following hours were a blur of performative grief and ruthless procedure, all orchestrated by Jonathan Ashworth. Eleanor, in a state of profound shock, was led to her room not as a comfort, but as a form of imprisonment. Jonathan's touch was no longer that of a concerned husband, but of a jailer. "You've had a terrible shock, my dear," he announced, for the benefit of the servants. "You must rest. We must protect you from any further excitement." The door closed, and she heard the unmistakable sound of the key turning in the lock. She was a prisoner in her own home, a spectre at the feast of her own ruin. Downstairs, Jonathan played the part of the distraught yet decisive patriarch. The local magistrate, a man named Purvis, whose fortunes were deeply intertwined with Ashworth's, was summoned. Over glasses of fine brandy, Jonathan and Riggs recounted their fabricated tale. It was a story of a brave overseer saving his mistress from a vicious attack by a rebellious, brutish slave. The man had been causing trouble for weeks, Riggs stated, his voice dripping with false solemnity. I warned him, but when I saw him advancing on Mrs. Ashworth in the garden, his intentions were clear. I acted to save her life. Magistrate Purvis, a man who saw the world through the lens of property and power, asked few questions. Why would he? The evidence was plain. The word of a respected planter and his overseer against that of a dead slave and a hysterical woman. The inquest was a mere formality. The official ruling, justifiable homicide in defense of the mistress's honor and person. Isaiah's body was disposed of without ceremony, another anonymous casualty of the system. The matter, in the eyes of the law and of Georgia society, was closed. But Jonathan's plan had only reached its first act. The attack was the foundation. Now, he began to construct the walls of Eleanor's cage. He started to speak of her in hushed, worried tones to visitors. He mentioned her fragile nerves, her increasingly peculiar fancies. He planted the seed, watering it with feigned concern that the trauma of that night had unhinged his poor, delicate wife. He needed to transition her from a victim to a villain, and then, ultimately, to a madwoman. For if she were declared insane, he could control her fortune and silence her forever within the cold stone walls of an asylum, a fate perhaps worse than the gallows. The cruelty of the deception was deepening, becoming a living thing within the walls of Willow Creek. A gilded cage is still a cage. For Eleanor, the grand bedroom with its silk drapes and fine mahogany furniture had become her cell. The lock on the door was her constant reality, but the more insidious prison was the narrative being woven around her. Jonathan, with the precision of a spider spinning its web, began the systematic campaign to erode her sanity in the eyes of the world. He started with small things. He would have her meals delivered by a terrified housemaid who refused to meet her eyes. He would then later complain to the housekeeper that Eleanor had refused to eat, claiming the food was poisoned. When Eleanor, in desperation, would cry out or pound on her door, Jonathan would be downstairs, shaking his head sadly for any guest within earshot. The fits are growing worse, he would sigh, his voice heavy with a burden he pretended to bear. The physician has recommended complete quiet. He isolated her from anyone who might have shown her kindness or believed her story, ensuring her only contact was with those loyal to him out of fear or financial dependence. He then moved to more overt tactics. One afternoon, he entered her room with a false, soothing smile. "The magistrate needs your formal statement, my dear." "A mere formality," he said, placing a sheet of paper and a quill on her writing desk. But when Eleanor, her hand trembling, began to write the truth, the sight of Riggs, the murder, the planted knife, Jonathan stood over her shoulder. "No, no, Eleanor," he chided softly, his hand covering hers, his grip like iron. "You are confused. The shock has affected your memory. You were in the garden. Isaiah attacked you. Riggs saved you." He would not leave until she had written the version of events he dictated, creating a legal document in her own hand that confirmed his lie. It was a masterpiece of psychological torture, forcing her to be the author of her own imprisonment. Through it all, one person watched this slow, methodical destruction with a heart full of frozen terror. Sarah. She was the one who brought Eleanor her trays, who saw the desperate, pleading look in the mistress's eyes. She was the one who heard Jonathan's honeyed lies in the hallway, twisted into threats once he was inside the room. The secret she carried became a lead weight in her soul. She knew the truth. She had heard the plan in its infancy. To stay silent was a moral sin that choked her, but to speak was a death sentence. She was trapped in the gulf between two horrors, her silence making her an unwilling accomplice to a cruel deception that was steadily tightening its grip around an innocent woman's mind. The silence in the main house became a palpable entity, broken only by the ticking of the grand clock in the foyer and the occasional muffled sob from behind. Eleanor's locked door. Jonathan Ashworth, confident his scheme was proceeding flawlessly, grew bolder. The facade of the grieving husband began to crack, revealing the cruel architect beneath. He started spending his evenings in his study with Riggs, the two men drinking, and their laughter a coarse, ugly sound, sometimes drifting up the stairs. It was a calculated insult, a display of power meant to torment Eleanor, to show her how utterly she had been defeated. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Sarah saw her chance. The house was asleep, save for the two men celebrating their evil downstairs. A sliver of light under the kitchen door told her the cook had retired. Heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, she moved through the darkened hallways, a phantom in her own life. She carried a small pitcher of water, a flimsy excuse for being out of her quarters should she be caught. But her destination was not the kitchen. It was the back staircase that led to the second floor, to Eleanor's room. She paused outside the heavy oak door, listening. She could hear a soft, rhythmic scraping from within. Leaning close to the keyhole, she whispered, so faintly it was barely more than a breath. "Missus?" The scraping stopped. A moment of dead silence, then a faint rustle as Eleanor moved to the other side of the door. "Who is it?" The voice was thin, frayed, the voice of a ghost. "It's Sarah, Missus." She risked a glance down the empty hallway. I heard them. The master and the overseer. Before it happened, I heard them planning." On the other side of the door, Eleanor's breath caught. The world, which had been reduced to a nightmare of confusion and despair, suddenly snapped into a terrible, clarifying focus. It was not a nightmare, it was a conspiracy. "Planning what?" she whispered back, her voice gaining a sliver of steel. "To make it look like you were involved. He mentioned your shawl, the one from Charleston." A small, broken sound escaped Eleanor's lips. It was the confirmation of her deepest dread. Her husband was not just taking advantage of a tragedy. He had authored it. He had murdered an innocent man and was now slowly, methodically murdering her. In that moment, any lingering affection or doubt withered and died. She was no longer a wife wronged, she was a prisoner of war. "Thank you, Sarah," Eleanor whispered, the words filled with a profound and desperate gratitude. "You have risked everything." "I can't do no more, Mrs." Sarah replied, her voice trembling with fear. "If they find me here." She didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences hung in the dark air between them. She had passed the torch of truth, but it was a tiny, flickering flame in an ocean of darkness. It was now Eleanor's burden to carry, locked away and powerless. The deception was complete, but the first, fragile crack of resistance had just been formed. The knowledge Sarah imparted was both a curse and a weapon. Locked in her gilded prison, Eleanor Ashworth was now armed with the terrible truth, but had no means to wield it. Her husband's narrative was solidifying around her like plaster. She could hear it in the hushed, pitying tones of the few visitors Jonathan allowed, their words carefully filtered through the lens of his lies. "Poor, delicate Eleanor," they would murmur, so broken by that savage attack. Jonathan, sensing a new, defiant stillness in his wife, escalated his campaign. He brought a doctor from Savannah, a man with cold hands and colder eyes, who asked Eleanor leading questions about her sleep, her nerves, whether she heard voices. When she vehemently denied any instability and tried to tell him about the conspiracy, her desperate, rushed words only served to confirm the diagnosis Jonathan had already paid for. A classic case of hysterical paranoia brought on by severe trauma, the doctor declared to Jonathan in the hallway, his voice carrying clearly through the door. "She is constructing elaborate fictions to make sense of the event. a common symptom. This was the final piece of Jonathan's legal strategy. A declaration of insanity would not only grant him control of her estate indefinitely, but it would permanently destroy her credibility. A mad woman's ravings about a conspiracy would be laughed out of any court, if they were even heard at all. He began to speak openly of seeking specialized care for her, a euphemism that sent a chill through the household. Everyone knew what it meant: the asylum, a living tomb from which few returned. Meanwhile, the moral weight of the plantation itself seemed to shift. A deep, sullen anger began to ferment in the slave quarters. Isaiah had been respected. His murder, and the cruel play that surrounded it, was not seen as a justifiable act, but as a profound injustice. The story Jonathan had sold to the white world held no water amongst those who knew Riggs's true nature and had witnessed the master's cold calculation. Whispers passed between the rows of cotton, a low, angry hum beneath the Georgia Sunday. They did not believe the mistress, a woman of her world, was innocent out of affection, but they saw her now as a fellow victim of the master's ruthless machinery. The cruelty that had been used to control them was now being turned on the white lady in the big house. The entire world of Willow Creek was being poisoned by Jonathan Ashworth's deception, and the ground was growing unstable beneath his feet. The air at Willow Creek grew thick with impending storm. Jonathan, drunk on power and the seeming success of his scheme, began to make his final move. Legal documents were drawn up, their language dry and bureaucratic, yet their intent was monstrous: a petition to the court to have Eleanor declared non compos mentis and committed to the Georgia Lunatic Asylum in Milledgeville. He spoke of it at dinner with a visiting business associate, his voice carrying a feigned, tragic resolve. "It is the only merciful course," he declared, the words slithering under Eleanor's door like venom, "for her own safety and for the safety of others." Inside her room, Eleanor heard this death sentence pronounced. The finality of it shattered the last of her passive despair. Sarah's secret, the knowledge of her husband's guilt, was a weapon she could no longer afford to keep sheathed. But how to wield it from a locked room? Her eyes fell upon the writing desk, the very place where Jonathan had forced her to pen her own false testimony. There was power in the written word. If she could not speak her truth, she would write it. Using the stolen moments when the house was quiet, she began. She tore blank end papers from the books in her room, her hand moving swiftly, desperately. She wrote of the conversation Sarah had overheard. She described the cold calculation in Jonathan's eyes in the garden, the theatrical placement of her shawl and knife by Riggs. She named Isaiah as an innocent victim, murdered for the sole purpose of destroying her. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a damning indictment. She folded the papers into a tiny, tight square, her heart pounding. She had the truth in her hand, but it was useless unless it could escape the walls of Willow Creek. Her opportunity came on a morning when a rare, torrential rain lashed against the windows. The noise was a cacophony that masked all other sound. She heard the familiar, light footsteps of Sarah approaching with her breakfast tray. As the key turned in the lock, Eleanor positioned herself by the door. The moment Sarah entered, Eleanor was upon her, not with violence, but with a desperate urgency. She pressed the folded papers into the young woman's hand, closing her fingers around them. "Sarah, you must get this to Magistrate Purvis," Eleanor whispered, her eyes burning with intensity. "Not here. To his home in town. It is the only chance for either of us." Sarah's eyes widened in terror. The tiny packet in her hand felt like a burning coal. To be caught carrying this would mean a fate worse than Isaiah's. She looked from the desperate, pale face of her mistress to the square of paper. It was no longer just a secret. It was a responsibility, a mission that could get her killed. She gave a single, sharp nod, hiding the papers in the folds of her dress, just as heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. The door was open. The truth was out of its cage. Now it had to survive. For 3 agonizing days, the folded papers, hidden in a loose floorboard beneath Sarah's pallet, felt like they were screaming. The weight of the truth was a physical burden. Every time Riggs's gaze passed over her, her blood ran cold. Jonathan's demeanor was one of smug finality. He spoke of travel to Milledgeville, of the arrangements being made. The walls of the asylum were closing in around Eleanor with each passing hour. Sarah's chance came on market day. The rain had passed, leaving the roads a quagmire, and Jonathan needed Riggs to oversee the loading of a cotton shipment, a task that would take him to the distant edge of the property. It was the sliver of daylight she needed. Volunteering to carry a basket of eggs to a neighboring farm, a common errand, she secured a pass. The packet of papers was tucked deep within the basket, nestled amongst the fragile brown eggs. Every step towards town was an exercise in terror. Every rider on the road, every creak of a wagon, sent a jolt of fear through her. She was a ghost, carrying a live bomb, and the fuse was burning low. She reached the magistrate's modest townhouse, her heart in her throat. She didn't go to the front door, the domain of the powerful. She went to the back, to the kitchen, where the enslaved cook looked up in surprise. Sarah's voice was a dry rasp. "A message for the master. From Willow Creek. It's about the trouble." She pressed the papers into the cook's flour-dusted hands, her own trembling violently. "He must read it. He must." Before she could be questioned further, she turned and fled, melting back into the streets, the basket feeling impossibly light without its deadly cargo. Back at Willow Creek, the hours dragged. Eleanor, listening for any change in the house's rhythm, heard nothing but the grim silence of her fate approaching. Jonathan dined alone, a smile playing on his lips. He had won. The following afternoon, the sound of an approaching horse did not belong to Riggs's familiar trot. It was slower, more deliberate. Peering from her window, Eleanor saw Magistrate Purvis dismount, his face unreadable. He was shown into Jonathan's study. The wait was torture. She heard the low rumble of voices, Jonathan's initially confident, then rising in pitch, becoming defensive, then angry. The truth, once set free, was a corrosive acid, eating through the polished veneer of Jonathan's lies. Purvis was a man of property and prejudice, but he was not a fool. The detailed written account, the specific mention of the shawl, the timeline it had, the ring of truth. It presented a story that, if made public, could cause a scandal that would damage him by association. Jonathan's perfect crime had a witness he had never accounted for, his wife's pen. The study door burst open. Jonathan's voice, shrill with rage, echoed through the house. "Slander, the ravings of a madwoman." But Magistrate Purvis's reply was low and firm. The argument moved to the foyer, directly below Eleanor's room. She could not make out the words, but she could feel the shift in power. Jonathan's deception, so perfect in its small, cruel world, was collapsing under the weight of a larger, more public reality. He was not arrested. The word of a planter still held immense sway over that of his wife and a slave. But the petition for insanity was abruptly withdrawn. The threat of the asylum vanished. Jonathan's control over Eleanor was broken. He could not silence her without raising even more damning suspicions. He was left a prisoner in his own home, shackled to the wife he had tried to destroy, living day after day under the gaze of a woman who knew him for the monster he was. He had escaped the gallows, but he was condemned to a life of bitter, gilded misery. Eleanor never regained her former life, but she reclaimed her mind, her freedom, and her fortune. A quiet, haunted victor in a war of Southern Gothic horror. The silence that fell over Willow Creek after that was different. It was not a quiet of secrets, but of a terrible, hard-won peace. If you are drawn into the shadows of history, to the stories where the real monsters wore human faces, then you belong here. Subscribe to Eclipsed Chronicles. We have many more dark truths to unearth. The victory was not clean. It was not a triumphant courtroom acquittal or a public vindication. It was a stalemate, forged in the cold, hard currency of social ruin. Jonathan Ashworth remained at Willow Creek, a king deposed in his own castle. The grand plantation, once a testament to his power, became his gilded cage. The whispers in Savannah drawing rooms were no longer about his wife's fragile mind, but about the unfortunate business at Willow Creek and the cloud of suspicion that would forever hang over him. He was shunned by some, pitied by others, but trusted by none. Eleanor, her spirit scarred but unbroken, moved into the east wing of the house, a world away from her husband. With the legal threat of the asylum gone and her control over her own fortune re-established through the relentless efforts of a new, sharp-eyed lawyer from Atlanta, she wielded a quiet, formidable power. She never spoke to Jonathan again. Their interactions were conducted through intermediaries, cold notes about estate matters passing between their separate domains. The house was divided, a cold war fought across a battlefield of polished floors and silent hallways. And what of Sarah? She became a spectral figure, the silent architect of the truth that had shattered the master's design. She was not freed. The world of 1838, Georgia did not allow for such neat endings. But her life on the plantation changed. She was never again assigned to the main house. Eleanor, in one of her first acts with her regained autonomy, saw to it that Sarah and her family were kept together and assigned to less brutal work in the sewing cottage. It was a small mercy in an ocean of injustice, but it was a tangible one. A silent understanding passed between the two women, a bond forged in the crucible of shared terror. They had looked into the same abyss and had, against all odds, survived its gaze. The story of the Willow Creek deception never became a celebrated court case. It was too messy, too dark, too revealing of the rot that could fester beneath the surface of Southern gentility. It lived on as a local legend, a ghost story told in whispers, a cautionary tale about the depths of human greed. But for those who lived it, the legacy was the heavy, unquiet silence that settled over the land, a silence that remembered the scream, the lie, and the fragile, hard-won truth that finally broke it. Some secrets are not meant to stay buried. They fester in the soil, waiting for a voice, a courage, a single desperate act to bring them into the light. This story was one of them. If you are drawn to the shadows, where history and horror intertwine, where the real hauntings are the deeds of men, then your chronicle awaits. Subscribe to Eclipsed Chronicles, and we will unearth the next dark truth together.